The shot that rang out across the valley sent a flock of startled birds into the sky as Grace Vellico pressed herself against the rough bark of a ponderosa pine. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she peered cautiously around the trunk. Evanston, Wyoming wasn't supposed to be this dangerous, at least not according to her uncle's letters. But in the spring of 1878, she was beginning to think he'd painted a far rosier picture than reality warranted. Another gunshot cracked through the air, followed by angry shouts. Grace gathered her skirts, preparing to flee deeper into the woods when she heard the unmistakable sound of a horse galloping her way. She flattened herself behind the tree again, holding her breath as the thundering hooves drew closer. The rider burst through the underbrush not 20 feet away, his horse nearly spent, foam flecking its heaving sides. The man was slumped forward, one hand clutching the saddle horn, the other pressed to his side. As Grace watched, he slid sideways and tumbled to the ground with a muffled groan. For a long moment she remained frozen, listening for pursuers. When none came, she cautiously approached the fallen man. His hat had come off in the fall, revealing dark hair thick with trail dust. His clothes, once fine, she could tell were torn and filthy. "Sir," she called softly. "Are you injured?" The man stirred, rolling onto his back with obvious pain. His eyes, startlingly blue against his dirt-streaked face, fixed on her with wariness. A day's growth of beard couldn't hide his strong jawline, nor could the grime conceal that he was handsome in a rough, dangerous sort of way. "You shouldn't be here, miss," he rasped. "Those men will be coming." "You're bleeding," Grace said, noticing the dark stain spreading across his shirt. "Let me help you." When she reached for him, he flinched away. "You shouldn't touch me," he warned, his voice low and rough. "I'm not worth saving." Grace hesitated only a moment before her chin lifted in determination. "Too late," she replied, kneeling beside him. "Now let me see that wound before you bleed to death." The man's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't resist when she gently moved his hand away from his side. The wound wasn't as bad as she'd feared, a bullet graze rather than a direct hit, but it was still bleeding freely. "I'm Grace," she said as she tore a strip from her petticoat to make a temporary bandage. "Grace Vellico." He watched her work, his expression guarded. "Jake," he finally replied. "Jake Blackburn." "Well, Mr. Blackburn, we need to get you somewhere safe. Can you ride?" A distant shout made them both tense. Jake struggled to his feet with Grace's help, whistling softly for his horse. The animal, having recovered somewhat, trotted over. "Get on," Jake said, gesturing to the saddle. "I'll walk." "Don't be ridiculous," Grace objected. "You're injured. And you're wearing skirts. Unless you plan to ride astride in front of the whole territory, you'd best take the saddle." Grace couldn't argue with his logic. With his help, she mounted the horse, then reached down to help him up behind her. He settled against her back, one arm wrapped around her waist, his breath warm against her neck. "Head west," he murmured. "There's an old line shack about 3 miles from here. We can lay low until dark." Grace nudged the horse forward, feeling Jake's weight shift behind her. She'd come to Wyoming to start fresh after losing her parents, to help her uncle with his mercantile. Finding a wounded cowboy hadn't been part of her plan, but then again, the best things in life rarely were. The line shack was barely more than 4 walls and a roof, with a tiny window and a door that hung crooked on rusty hinges. Inside was a narrow cot, a small table with 1 chair, and a cold stone fireplace. Grace helped Jake to the cot before searching the cabin for supplies. "There's some jerky and beans," she said, examining a dusty shelf. "And what looks like coffee, though I wouldn't vouch for its quality." Jake leaned back against the wall, his face pale beneath the dirt and stubble. "There should be a medical kit under the bed." The ranchers keep these shacks stocked for emergencies. Grace found the kit, a small wooden box containing bandages, a bottle of whiskey, a needle and catgut for stitching. She set about cleaning his wound properly, trying not to notice how his muscles tensed under her touch or the way his eyes followed her every move. "You're good at this," he observed. "My father was a doctor," she replied, carefully washing away dried blood. "I assisted him sometimes." "And what brings a doctor's daughter to Wyoming territory?" Grace focused on applying a clean bandage. "My parents died last winter, influenza. My uncle offered me a home here in Evanston. He owns the mercantile." Thomas Vellico is your uncle? Jake asked, his voice suddenly tense. Grace looked up, surprised. You know him. A shadow crossed Jake's face. Everyone in Evanston knows Thomas Vellico. There was something in his tone that made Grace uneasy. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Jake looked away. Depends on who you ask. Grace finished tying off the bandage and sat back. And if I'm asking you, his blue eyes met hers, filled with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Then I'd say you should be careful, Miss Vellico. It's Grace, she corrected automatically. And I'd appreciate if you'd tell me why I need to be careful of my own uncle. Jake sighed, wincing as he shifted position. Your uncle has powerful friends, and he's not above using that influence to get what he wants. The railroad coming through has made some men very rich and others very desperate. And which are you? Grace asked boldly. A rueful smile touched his lips. I used to be the former, now I'm definitely the latter. Before Grace could question him further, the sound of approaching riders made them both freeze. Jake was on his feet in an instant, his hand going to his empty holster. My gun, he muttered. Must have lost it when I fell. Grace peered through the grimy window. 4 riders coming fast. Jake grabbed her arm. Out the back. There's a root cellar behind the cabin. If we're lucky, they'll think the place is empty. They slipped out the back door and into a small dugout concealed by overgrown brush. Jake pulled the door closed just as the riders reached the cabin. In the darkness, Grace found herself pressed against Jake's chest, his heartbeat strong under her palm. Who are those men? She whispered. Hired guns, Jake replied softly. Working for the man who wants me dead. And who might that be? Jake was silent for a long moment. Your uncle, he finally said. Grace's gasp was cut short by Jake's hand covering her mouth. Above them, boots thudded on the wooden floor of the cabin. Check the back, a gruff voice ordered. Grace trembled, not just from fear but from the shock of Jake's revelation. Why would her uncle want this man dead? Thomas had always written of his honest business dealings, his respect in the community. Could Jake be lying? But if so, why had those men been shooting at him? They remained hidden for what seemed like hours, though it was probably only 30 minutes. Eventually, the riders left, convinced the cabin was empty. Jake waited another 10 minutes before easing open the cellar door. They'll be back, he said grimly. We need to move. Grace followed him out into the fading daylight. I want answers, Mr. Blackburn. If my uncle truly wants you dead, I deserve to know why. Jake checked his horse, which they'd hidden in a thicket behind the cabin. It's a long story and one that doesn't paint me in the best light. I'm not asking for flattery, Grace retorted. I'm asking for truth. Something like respect flickered in Jake's eyes. Fair enough, but we should put some distance between us and those riders first. They mounted up as before, with Grace in the saddle and Jake behind her. As they rode deeper into the foothills, the setting sun painted the landscape in gold and crimson. Under different circumstances, Grace might have found it beautiful. I came to Evanston 3 years ago, Jake began, his voice low near her ear. I had money to invest and the railroad was bringing opportunity. Your uncle and I became partners in a mine, the Lost Creek Silver Mine. Grace nodded. Thomas had mentioned the mine in his letters. It was profitable from the start, Jake continued. But last year I discovered Thomas was skimming profits, cooking the books. When I confronted him, he claimed I was the thief. He had the sheriff in his pocket, and suddenly I found myself facing prison. So you ran, Grace guessed. Jake's arm tightened slightly around her waist. I fled, yes. But I also gathered evidence, account books, letters, receipts that proved his guilt. I've spent 6 months tracking down former employees willing to testify. And now you're back to clear your name, Grace concluded. I was, Jake agreed. Until someone recognized me in town this morning and alerted your uncle. Now I'm just trying to stay alive long enough to reach the federal marshal in Green River. Grace's mind whirled with conflicting emotions. She barely knew her uncle hadn't seen him since she was a child, but he was her only remaining family. Yet something in Jake's story rang true, and the men hunting him had certainly been intent on violence. I believe you, she said at last. Jake's surprise was evident in his voice. Just like that. Grace shook her head. Not just like that, but I've always been a good judge of character, and despite your current state, I don't think you're a killer or a thief. They made camp that night in a sheltered canyon, building a small fire screened by rocks so the light wouldn't be visible from a distance. Jake shared the jerky he'd grabbed from the line shack, and they drank water from a clear stream. "You never did explain why those men were chasing you today," Grace said as they sat beside the fire. Jake poked at the embers with a stick. "I made a mistake. Thought I could sneak into town to gather the last piece of evidence. I needed a ledger your uncle keeps in his office safe. Someone spotted me. What will you do now? Head to Green River. The evidence I have might be enough to convince the marshal to investigate." Grace watched the firelight play across his features. With most of the dust washed away from his face, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 28 or 30. There was a scar above his right eyebrow and another along his jawline. A man who'd seen trouble before. "I'm coming with you," she announced. Jake's head snapped up. "Absolutely not. I wasn't asking permission," Grace said firmly. "If what you say about my uncle is true, I can't simply go to him as planned, and I can help you. The marshal is more likely to listen if I corroborate your story." "It's dangerous," Jake argued. "Those men won't hesitate to hurt you to get to me. All the more reason to travel together," Grace countered. "Two stand a better chance than one alone." Jake studied her with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met, Grace Vellico." "I'll take that as a compliment, Mr. Blackburn." A reluctant smile tugged at his lips. "Jake," he corrected. "If we're going to be traveling companions, might as well use my given name." Grace smiled back, suddenly aware of how intimate their situation was, alone in the wilderness, sharing a fire, planning to face danger together. It was wildly improper, yet she couldn't bring herself to care. For the first time since losing her parents, she felt truly alive. They rode out at dawn, keeping to the high country where they'd be harder to track. Jake proved to be a skilled woodsman, finding game trails and water sources where Grace saw only wilderness. By midday, they reached a vantage point overlooking a broad valley. "Green River is about 2 days' ride that way," Jake said, pointing west. "But we'll need supplies if we're going to make it." Grace nodded, her practical nature taking over. "There's a trading post at the north end of the valley. My uncle mentioned it in his letters, Swenson's place." Jake considered this. "Risky, word might have spread that I'm on the run." "Let me go alone," Grace suggested. "No one's looking for me." Jake's expression darkened. "Out of the question." "Be reasonable," Grace insisted. "I can say I'm heading to visit friends in Green River before continuing to Evanston. No one will question it." They argued for several minutes before Jake reluctantly agreed, but only with conditions. "You get what we need and leave immediately. If anything seems off, you walk away. I'll be watching from that ridge." The trading post was busier than Grace had expected, with a half-dozen horses hitched outside. She straightened her travel-wrinkled dress as best she could, and adopted the confident air she'd learned from her father when visiting patients from less reputable parts of town. Inside, the store was dim and crowded with merchandise shelves stacked with goods, barrels of flour and sugar, tools hanging from rafters. A counter ran along one wall, behind which stood a barrel-chested man with an impressive beard. "Afternoon, miss," he greeted her. "Don't believe I've seen you before," Grace offered her most charming smile. "I'm just passing through on my way to visit friends in Green River. I find myself in need of supplies." The man, presumably Swenson, seemed to accept this. "What can I help you with?" Grace purchased coffee, flour, bacon, ammunition for Jake's revolver, which she claimed was for her father's gun, and a few other necessities. As Swenson wrapped her purchases, the door opened and 2 men entered. Grace kept her head down, her pulse quickening. She recognized one of them from the group that had chased Jake the day before. "Heard any news from Evanston, Swenson?" one asked casually. "Not since last week," the shopkeeper replied. "Why? Looking for a fellow, tall, dark-haired, rides a sorrel with a white blaze. Thief he is. Stole from Mr. Vellico himself." Grace forced herself to remain calm as she counted out coins to pay for her purchases. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description," Swenson said, "but I'll keep an eye out. You do that, there's a $100 reward." Grace gathered her supplies, nodding politely to the men as she headed for the door. She'd almost made it when one of them called out. "Miss, you riding alone?" She turned, her face composed. "My father is waiting for me outside. He's not fond of trading posts, prefers the open air." The man seemed satisfied with this explanation, and Grace escaped without further questioning. She mounted her horse and rode away at a measured pace, resisting the urge to gallop. Only when she was well out of sight did she veer toward the ridge where Jake waited. "We need to move," she said urgently as she reached him. "They're looking for you at the trading post, offering a reward." Jake helped her secure the supplies to his saddle. "Did they recognize you?" "No, but they mentioned my uncle by name. They're calling you a thief." Jake's jaw tightened. "Your uncle is getting desperate. That means we're close." They pushed hard that afternoon, covering difficult terrain that would be challenging to follow. By nightfall, they'd crossed the valley and were ascending into the western foothills. They made cold camp that night, not risking a fire. As they shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, Grace found herself studying Jake in the moonlight. The past 2 days had changed something between them. Trust had grown, along with something else, something that made her breath catch when their hands accidentally touched. "Tell me about your life before all this," she said softly. Jake was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. "I grew up in Missouri," he finally said. "My father was a blacksmith, taught me the trade, but I wanted more than a small-town life, so I headed west after the war." "Were you a soldier?" He nodded. "Union Army, too young to fight much, but old enough to see what men are capable of doing to each other." "And after, I drifted. Worked cattle drives, did some prospecting, got lucky with a small gold claim in Colorado. That gave me the stake to invest in the Lost Creek mine." A bitter smile crossed his face. "Thought I'd finally made something of myself, shows what I know." "You haven't lost everything," Grace said. "You have your integrity, that's worth more than silver." Jake looked at her then, really looked at her, and Grace felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "Most women would have run screaming from this situation," he observed, "or at least demanded to be taken to the nearest town." Grace shrugged. "I'm not most women." "No," Jake agreed softly. "You certainly are not." They were interrupted by the distant sound of a horse nickering. Jake was on his feet instantly, hand on his gun. "Someone's coming," he whispered. "Multiple riders moving quiet." They quickly gathered their belongings, but before they could mount up, riders appeared, surrounding them. Grace counted 6 men, all armed, their faces grim in the moonlight. "Well, well," drawled the leader, a thin-faced man with a drooping mustache. "Jake Blackburn and a lady friend." "Mr. Vellico will be mighty pleased." Jake pushed Grace behind him. "Let her go, Curtis. She has nothing to do with this." Curtis smiled unpleasantly. "That's where you're wrong. Mr. Vellico is especially interested in meeting his niece." Grace felt a chill run down her spine. "How did you know?" "Small towns, big ears," Curtis replied. "Word gets around, now you'll both be coming with us." Jake's hand tightened on his gun. "I don't think so." "Don't be stupid, Blackburn," Curtis warned. "There's 6 of us and one of you. The lady might get hurt in the crossfire." Grace could feel Jake's tension, knew he was calculating odds they both knew were terrible. "Jake," she murmured, placing a hand on his arm. "Don't." After a long moment, Jake slowly raised his hands. "If you harm one hair on her head, I'll kill you," he said, his voice deadly calm. Curtis just laughed. "Tie them up, boys. Mr. Vellico is expecting us by morning." They were bound and placed on their own horses, then led through the night at a punishing pace. Grace's mind raced, trying to find a way out of their situation. Jake rode beside her, his face a mask of controlled fury. Once, when their captors weren't looking, he caught her eye and mouthed, "Trust me." Dawn was breaking when they reached Evanston, a sprawling town nestled in the valley. Grace had imagined arriving here under very different circumstances, perhaps being met by her uncle at the stage depot, being shown to a comfortable room in his house. Instead, they were taken directly to a large building with a sign proclaiming it the offices of the Vellico Mining Company. Curtis dismounted and went inside, returning moments later with a tall, distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit. "Uncle Thomas," Grace said coolly. Thomas Vellico studied her with shrewd eyes. "Grace, this is not how I envisioned our reunion. I'm disappointed to find you in such questionable company." "The feeling is mutual," Grace replied. "I've heard some disturbing things about your business practices." Her uncle's expression hardened. I see Blackburn has been filling your head with lies, unfortunate but not surprising. Why don't you untie us and we can discuss those lies properly? Jake suggested, his tone deceptively light. Vellico ignored him, addressing Curtis instead. Take them to the warehouse. I'll deal with them there. They were led to a large structure at the edge of town. Inside, crates and mining equipment filled the space, with an office partitioned off at one end. Grace and Jake were pushed into chairs, still bound, while Vellico dismissed all but Curtis and one other guard. Now then, Vellico said, leaning against a desk. Let's discuss the situation like civilized people. There's nothing civilized about sending men to kill me, Jake replied. Vellico waved a hand dismissively. A misunderstanding. My men were instructed to bring you in, not harm you. Is that why they were shooting at me? Overzealous employees, I'll deal with them later. Vellico turned to Grace. I apologize that your introduction to Evanston has been so dramatic. This man is a thief who embezzled from our mine. I was simply trying to recover what he stole. Grace met her uncle's gaze steadily. I find that hard to believe, especially since Jake has evidence that suggests you're the real thief. Vellico's pleasant expression faltered. What evidence? Account books, Jake said. Correspondence, statements from former employees. All safely delivered to the federal marshal in Green River yesterday. Grace kept her face impassive, though this was news to her. Vellico studied Jake for a long moment. You're bluffing? Am I? Why don't you send one of your men to check? Of course, by the time they get back, the marshal might already be on his way here. It was a gamble, Grace realized. Jake was betting that Vellico wouldn't risk checking his story, but she could see the doubt creeping into her uncle's expression. Curtis, Vellico said sharply. Go to the telegraph office. Send a message to our friend in Green River. Ask if any packages or messages have arrived for the marshal from Mr. Blackburn. Curtis nodded and left. Vellico turned back to Jake, his composure regained. Even if you did send something, it won't matter. Your word against mine, and I'm a respected businessman while you're a fugitive. That's where you're wrong, Jake replied calmly. I have your signature on documents showing altered figures. I have witnesses who saw you change the records. And I have the real account books that show exactly how much silver was mined and where the money went. For the first time, Grace saw genuine alarm in her uncle's eyes. You're lying, Vellico insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. Jake smiled thinly. I spent 6 months building my case. Did you really think I'd come back without making sure it was solid? The warehouse door banged open and Curtis rushed in, his face pale. Boss, we got trouble. Marshal's deputy just rode into town with 2 other lawmen. Vellico's face hardened. Get the horses ready, we're leaving. Running, Thomas, Jake taunted. That won't look good to your investors. Shut up, Vellico snapped. He pulled a gun from his coat pocket. I should have done this months ago. Grace's heart hammered in her chest as her uncle aimed the weapon at Jake's head. Uncle Thomas, don't. You can't murder a man in cold blood. Stay out of this, Grace, Vellico warned. You don't understand what's at stake. I understand perfectly, she replied. You stole from your partner and now you're willing to kill to cover it up. My father always said you were ambitious, but he never mentioned you were a thief and a murderer. Vellico's hand wavered slightly at the mention of her father. In that moment of distraction, Jake made his move. Despite his bound hands, he lunged forward, knocking Vellico off balance. The gun discharged, the bullet splintering the wooden floor. Curtis drew his weapon, but Grace was faster. She swung her bound hands like a club, catching him in the temple. He staggered, and the remaining guard rushed forward, only to be met by Jake's shoulder ramming into his midsection. The commotion brought people running. The warehouse door burst open again, and 3 men wearing badges stormed in, guns drawn. Nobody move, shouted the lead man, a grizzled lawman with a silver star pinned to his vest. Grace had never been so relieved to see the law in her life. The aftermath unfolded with dizzying speed. Vellico and his men were arrested. Jake's bonds were cut, as were Grace's. The marshal's deputy confirmed that they had indeed received Jake's evidence the previous day. Delivered by a ranch hand, Jake had paid handsomely to make the journey while he created a diversion. You planned this, Grace realized as they sat on a bench outside the sheriff's office, watching as her uncle was led away to the jail. Jake nodded, rubbing his chafed wrists. Not all of it. Getting captured wasn't part of the plan. But I knew we were being followed, so I sent the evidence ahead with a trusted friend. You might have told me, Grace said, a hint of irritation in her voice. I couldn't risk it. If we'd been captured, which we were, you needed to be genuinely surprised. Vellico would have seen through anything less. Grace couldn't argue with his logic, though she still felt a twinge of annoyance at being kept in the dark. What happens now? She asked instead. Jake sighed, suddenly looking tired. Now I rebuild. The marshal says I should be able to recover my share of the mine, maybe even Vellico's portion as compensation. That's good, Grace said softly. Jake turned to her, his blue eyes serious. What about you? Will you stay in Evanston? It was a question Grace had been pondering herself. I don't know. I came here to start over, but now. You could go back east, Jake suggested, though she noticed he didn't sound enthusiastic about the idea. Grace shook her head. There's nothing for me there, but I'm not sure there's anything for me here either. Jake was silent for a long moment. There could be, he finally said, his voice low. If you wanted. Grace's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? Jake took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. I mean that in the past 3 days, I've come to admire you more than any woman I've ever known. You're brave and smart and stubborn in all the right ways. He paused, looking suddenly uncertain. I know it's fast and probably inappropriate given everything that's happened, but I'd like to court you properly, if you'd allow it. A slow smile spread across Grace's face. I think I'd like that very much, Jake Blackburn. His answering smile made her pulse quicken. I should warn you I'm still covered in dust, and there's a fair bit of shame in my recent past. Grace squeezed his hand. I believe I already told you it was too late for warnings. The months that followed were a time of healing and growth for both of them. Jake was cleared of all charges, and as he'd predicted, the court awarded him control of the Lost Creek mine as compensation for Vellico's theft. Thomas Vellico was sentenced to 10 years in the territorial prison. Grace decided to stay in Evanston, using her inheritance to open a small medical practice, focusing primarily on women and children. Her father would have been proud, she thought, to see her using the knowledge he'd taught her. Jake courted her properly, as promised. They took Sunday rides and had dinner at the hotel restaurant. He brought her wildflowers and books from Denver when he traveled there on business. The townspeople, initially scandalized by their unconventional meeting, gradually accepted them as a couple, especially after Jake donated generously to the new schoolhouse fund. In the evenings, they often sat on the porch of Jake's modest house at the edge of town, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in impossible colors. I've been thinking, Jake said one such evening, a year after they'd met. A dangerous pastime, Grace teased, comfortable in the easy rapport they'd developed. Jake smiled, but there was a nervous edge to it. I've been offered a partnership in a cattle operation near the Green River. Good land, healthy stock. That sounds promising, Grace said, wondering why he seemed anxious. It would mean moving, Jake continued, building a new home. Oh, Grace tried to mask her disappointment. They'd become so established in Evanston with her practice and his business. I see, Jake took her hand. The thing is, I don't want to go without you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Grace Vellico, will you marry me, not because of what we've been through, but because of who we've become together? Grace stared at the simple gold ring nestled in the box, emotions welling up inside her. Yes, she whispered, then louder, yes. Jake slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her close, his kiss gentle yet passionate. When they finally broke apart, Grace rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. You know, she said thoughtfully, a doctor could do well in a ranching community, plenty of broken bones and babies to deliver. Jake laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. Always practical, my Grace. One of us has to be, she replied with a smile. They were married that autumn in a simple ceremony attended by the friends they'd made in Evanston. By spring, they'd built a sturdy ranch house on their new land with a small office for Grace's medical practice. Jake's cattle business flourished, as did her work with the local families. 2 years later, their son was born a strong, healthy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. They named him Thomas, not after Grace's uncle, but after her father, a good man whose legacy deserved to live on. On quiet evenings, with their son asleep and the ranch hands settled for the night, Jake and Grace would often sit on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. Sometimes they spoke of the future expanding the ranch, having more children growing old together. Other times they simply sat in comfortable silence, Grace's head on Jake's shoulder, his arm around her waist. "Do you ever regret it?" Jake asked one night. "Finding me that day, getting involved in all that trouble," Grace smiled, thinking of the frightened, desperate man she'd discovered covered in dust and shame, and the strong, honorable husband he'd become. "Not for a single moment," she replied, reaching up to trace the scar above his eyebrow. "Some people spend their whole lives looking for the kind of love we found in 3 days." Jake caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I told you not to touch me," he reminded her with a smile. Grace laughed softly. "And I told you it was too late." "Thank God for that," Jake murmured, drawing her close as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky.